Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for nearly 3 decades, transforming a peasant nation into an industrial superpower while leaving behind a legacy written in blood. His paranoia was legendary, his purges ruthless, and his security apparatus among the most sophisticated the world had ever seen. Yet, despite the layers of protection, the networks of informants, and the climate of absolute terror he cultivated, there were those who dared to imagine his death. Some plotted in secret rooms, others acted in desperation. A few came closer than history often remembers. This is the story of 4 documented attempts to end the life of one of the 20th century's most formidable dictators, each revealing something profound about the nature of totalitarian power, the courage of resistance, and the razor-thin margins that separate historical inevitability from chaos. The first serious attempt on Stalin's life emerged not from foreign enemies or political rivals, but from within the heart of the Bolshevik movement itself, during a period when the revolution was still young and the future uncertain. In the summer of 1918, as Russia descended into civil war and the Bolsheviks fought desperately to maintain control, a woman named Fanya Kaplan walked through the gates of the Michelson factory in Moscow, carrying a Browning pistol. The date was August 30th, and Lenin, not Stalin, was her primary target that day. But the events that followed would directly threaten Stalin's life and reshape the entire architecture of Soviet security for generations to come. Kaplan, a former anarchist turned socialist revolutionary, had become disillusioned with Bolshevik rule. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, and the increasing authoritarian nature of Lenin's government had convinced her that the revolution had betrayed its principles. As Lenin left the factory after addressing workers, Kaplan approached and fired 3 shots. 2 bullets struck Lenin in the shoulder and neck. He survived, though the wounds would contribute to his declining health and eventual death in 1924. The immediate response was swift and brutal. Felix Dzerzhinsky, head of the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, launched what became known as the Red Terror, a campaign of mass executions and arrests, targeting anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. Stalin, then People's Commissar for Nationalities, was in Tsaritsyn, the city later renamed Stalingrad in his honor, when news of the attempt reached him. He had been conducting military operations against the White forces and already demonstrating the ruthless efficiency that would characterize his rule. The attack on Lenin convinced Stalin and other Bolshevik leaders that their enemies were everywhere, that compromise was weakness, and that only through absolute control and preemptive violence could the revolution survive. This moment crystallized Stalin's worldview. He understood that power required not just political maneuvering, but the systematic elimination of potential threats before they could materialize. Kaplan was executed by the Cheka on September 3, 1918, shot in the back of the head in the Kremlin courtyard. But her legacy lived on in the paranoid security state that Stalin would later perfect. The second attempt occurred in 1924, during the chaotic period following Lenin's death when Stalin was consolidating power against rivals like Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. The details of this plot remain murky, buried in archives and obscured by decades of Soviet disinformation. But what emerges from historical records is a conspiracy involving disaffected military officers and former Tsarist sympathizers who saw Stalin's rise as the final death knell for any hope of moderate governance. According to documents from the OGPU, the successor to the Cheka, a group of Red Army officers stationed in the Caucasus region planned to assassinate Stalin during his visit to Tiflis, his birthplace in Georgia, in the autumn of that year. Stalin had always maintained complex relationships with his Georgian homeland. He was both proud of his origins and dismissive of Georgian nationalism, seeing it as a threat to Soviet unity. His visit in October 1924 was meant to demonstrate his authority and connection to the region, but intelligence reports suggested that former Mensheviks and nationalist sympathizers saw it as an opportunity. The plot involved ambushing Stalin's motorcade on the mountain roads between Tiflis and Gori, using the terrain and local knowledge to overcome his security detail. The conspirators allegedly included a colonel named Boris Shavgolidze and several junior officers whose names were later erased from official records. The OGPU, under the leadership of Vyacheslav Menjinsky, had infiltrated the group through informants, a tactic that would become standard practice in Soviet counterintelligence. The plotters were arrested approximately 2 weeks before Stalin's scheduled arrival. The subsequent interrogations were brutal, conducted in the basement of the Tiflis OGPU headquarters. Under torture, the accused confessed to planning not just Stalin's assassination, but a broader uprising aimed at separating Georgia from Soviet control. Whether these confessions reflected reality or were extracted through coercion remains debatable. But the consequences were real. 27 people were executed, including Shavgolidze, and dozens more were sent to labor camps in Siberia. Stalin never publicly acknowledged the plot, but those close to him noted a hardening in his demeanor, an increased distrust even of longtime associates, and a determination to ensure that no region, no matter how remote, remained outside the reach of Moscow's security apparatus. The third attempt came in 1937, at the height of the Great Terror, when Stalin's purges were consuming the party, the military, and Soviet society at large. Paradoxically, it was during this period of maximum paranoia and control that one of the most credible threats to Stalin's life emerged, not from enemies of the state, but from within the NKVD itself, the very organization tasked with protecting him. The central figure was Genrikh Yagoda, the former head of the NKVD who had orchestrated much of the early purge machinery before falling victim to Stalin's suspicions and being replaced by Nikolai Yezhov in September 1936. Yagoda's arrest in March 1937 sent shockwaves through the security apparatus. He had been one of Stalin's most trusted executioners, overseeing the Moscow show trials and the expansion of the Gulag system. But Stalin, ever wary of those who knew too much, had decided Yagoda had become a liability. During his interrogation, Yagoda allegedly revealed, or was forced to confess to, a plot involving NKVD officers and Kremlin medical staff to poison Stalin gradually, using medications and treatments that would appear natural given Stalin's age and stress levels. The conspiracy supposedly included Dr. Lev Levin, one of the Kremlin physicians, who had access to Stalin during routine medical examinations. The poisoning plot, if it existed beyond the realm of forced confessions, represented a sophisticated approach to assassination. Rather than bullets or bombs, which would trigger immediate investigations and potential martyrdom, a slow poisoning could be disguised as natural causes, potentially allowing for a smoother transition of power or even a reversal of some of Stalin's most extreme policies. The alleged method involved introducing small doses of toxic substances into medications prescribed for Stalin's chronic ailments, including his stomach problems and high blood pressure. According to testimony extracted during the show trial in March 1938, the plot had been underway for months, with Stalin unknowingly ingesting compounds designed to weaken his heart and induce a fatal stroke. The historical consensus among scholars is divided on whether this plot was genuine or manufactured by Stalin himself to justify further purges of the NKVD and medical establishment. What remains indisputable is that Yagoda, Dr. Levin, and approximately 15 others were convicted of treason and terrorism in the Trial of the 21, one of the last major show trials of the Stalin era. Yagoda was executed by firing squad on March 15, 1938. The trial served multiple purposes for Stalin. It demonstrated that no one, regardless of past service or proximity to power, was beyond suspicion. It allowed him to eliminate potential rivals who possessed dangerous knowledge about his crimes. And it reinforced the narrative that enemies surrounded him constantly, justifying the continuation of the terror even as it began consuming itself. The fourth, and perhaps most dramatic attempt, occurred during World War II, in the desperate days of 1942, when Nazi forces were pushing deep into Soviet territory, and the outcome of the war remained uncertain. This plot originated not from within the Soviet Union, but from Nazi Germany's intelligence services, specifically Operation Zeppelin, a program run by the SS and the Abwehr to infiltrate Soviet territory and conduct sabotage, assassination, and espionage operations. The target was Stalin himself, and the plan involved using Soviet prisoners of war who had been turned by German intelligence and parachuted behind Soviet lines. The operation was conceived by Walter Schellenberg, head of the SS Foreign Intelligence Service, and approved by Heinrich Himmler in the spring of 1942. The strategic logic was clear. Stalin was not merely the Soviet leader, but the personification of Soviet resistance. His death could potentially fracture the Soviet command structure, demoralize the population, and create opportunities for a negotiated peace or internal coup. The Germans had observed how Stalin's cult of personality had become central to Soviet morale, with his image appearing on posters, his name invoked in battle cries, and his speeches broadcast to frontline troops. Eliminating him might accomplish what military force alone could not. The Germans recruited a team of agents from among Soviet POWs held in camps throughout occupied Europe. These men, facing starvation and death in German captivity, were offered survival in exchange for cooperation. The primary operative was a former Red Army officer named Pyotr Tavrin, who had been captured during the disastrous encirclements of 1941. Tavrin and his team underwent intensive training at a special facility near Berlin, learning demolition techniques, radio operation, and methods for evading Soviet security. The plan called for them to parachute into the forests near Moscow, make contact with partisan groups or sympathetic civilians, and infiltrate the capital with explosives designed to destroy Stalin's motorcade or residence. In September 1942, Tavrin and 3 other agents were dropped by aircraft into territory approximately 200 kilometers from Moscow. What the Germans did not know was that Tavrin had never truly defected. From the moment of his recruitment, he had been planning to turn himself in to Soviet authorities and expose the operation. Within 48 hours of landing, Tavrin made contact with NKVD border guards and revealed the entire plot. The other agents were captured, and the weapons and explosives were seized. Stalin was informed immediately, and the incident reinforced his already extreme security measures. The captured agents were interrogated extensively, providing Soviet intelligence with valuable information about German intelligence operations and training methods. Rather than simply executing the conspirators, Stalin saw an opportunity for a counterintelligence operation. The NKVD under Lavrenti Beria used the captured radios to send false information back to German handlers, a practice known as radio playback or the double-cross system. For months, the Germans believed their agents were successfully operating in Moscow, gathering intelligence and preparing for the assassination. In reality, every message was controlled by Soviet intelligence, feeding the Nazis disinformation about Soviet military capabilities and intentions. Tavrin himself became something of a hero in Soviet intelligence circles, though his story remained classified for decades. He was awarded the Order of the Red Star and given a position within NKVD counterintelligence, where he helped identify other potential German agents and infiltration attempts. The operation demonstrated both the sophistication of German intelligence efforts and the effectiveness of Soviet counterintelligence in protecting Stalin. It also highlighted Stalin's value to the Soviet war effort, as even Nazi leadership recognized that his elimination could alter the course of the conflict. The broader implications of these 4 assassination attempts extend far beyond the immediate threats to Stalin's life. Each incident contributed to the development of the Soviet security state, a system of surveillance, control, and preemptive violence that would define the USSR for decades. The Kaplan attempt on Lenin, though not directly targeting Stalin, established the template of mass repression as a response to individual acts of resistance. The Tiflis plot of 1924 reinforced Stalin's belief that regional nationalism and military officers posed constant dangers, leading to purges of both throughout his rule. The Yagoda poisoning conspiracy, whether real or fabricated, demonstrated Stalin's willingness to destroy even the security apparatus itself when it suited his purposes, and the Nazi infiltration attempt validated his extreme security measures and justified the paranoia that characterized his leadership during and after the war. Stalin's survival of these threats was not merely a matter of luck or effective security. It reflected the fundamental nature of totalitarian power, which operates not through the strength of a single individual, but through the systematic elimination of alternatives. Stalin created a system where potential assassins faced not just personal risk, but the certainty that their families, friends, and associates would be destroyed along with them. He cultivated an atmosphere where loyalty was demonstrated through participation in violence, making everyone complicit and everyone vulnerable. The security measures surrounding Stalin were legendary. He never announced his travel plans in advance, often changing routes and schedules at the last moment. He maintained multiple residences and rarely slept in the same location twice. His food was prepared by a dedicated staff whose families were held essentially hostage to ensure their loyalty. Tasters sampled every meal. His inner circle was constantly rotated, preventing anyone from becoming too familiar or comfortable. Yet, for all these precautions, Stalin lived in a prison of his own making. His daughter, Svetlana Alliluyeva, later wrote about the isolation and paranoia that defined his final years, describing a man who trusted no one and found genuine human connection impossible. The very measures that protected him from assassination also separated him from reality, as subordinates learned to tell him only what he wanted to hear, fearing that honest reporting might be interpreted as disloyalty. This information bubble contributed to strategic errors, including his refusal to believe warnings about the German invasion in June 1941, which nearly cost the Soviet Union its survival. The question of what might have happened had any of these assassination attempts succeeded remains one of history's great counterfactuals. Would the Soviet Union have evolved differently under alternative leadership? Could the terror have been avoided or mitigated? Might the Cold War have taken a different form? The answers remain speculative, but the attempts themselves reveal something essential about the nature of dictatorship and resistance. In a system built on fear and violence, the assassination of a leader becomes not just a political act, but a desperate assertion of human agency against totalitarian control. When Stalin finally died on March 5, 1953, it was not from an assassin's bullet or poison, but from a stroke, possibly hastened by the stress of ruling through terror and the physical toll of decades of paranoia. Yet even his death was surrounded by controversy and suspicion. Some historians have suggested that his treatment was deliberately delayed by members of his inner circle, including Beria, who may have seen his incapacitation as an opportunity to seize power or at least prevent a final purge that they feared was coming. If true, this would represent a fifth assassination attempt, carried out not through violence, but through medical neglect by those closest to him who had finally concluded that their own survival required his death. The legacy of these assassination attempts and the security state they helped create extended far beyond Stalin's lifetime. The KGB, successor to the NKVD, continued to operate with the assumption that enemies surrounded the Soviet leadership at all times, justifying surveillance of millions and the maintenance of a vast apparatus of control. Dissidents throughout the Cold War faced not just imprisonment, but the knowledge that their families would suffer, that their friends would be interrogated, that resistance carried a price, measured in generations. The culture of denunciation, where citizens informed on neighbors and colleagues to demonstrate loyalty or settle personal scores, became deeply embedded in Soviet society, creating social fractures that persisted long after the USSR's collapse. In examining these four attempts on Stalin's life, we confront uncomfortable truths about power, violence, and historical change. The individuals who plotted against Stalin, whether from ideological conviction, personal desperation, or nationalist sentiment, demonstrated courage that history has largely forgotten. They faced near certain death and the destruction of everyone they loved, yet they acted anyway, driven by the belief that one man's death might alter the course of history. That they failed speaks both to the effectiveness of totalitarian security measures and to the systemic nature of Stalinist power, which was never truly dependent on Stalin alone, but on the millions who participated in or acquiesced to the machinery of repression. The modern world continues to grapple with Stalin's legacy. In Russia today, his reputation has undergone partial rehabilitation, with some viewing him as a strong leader who defeated fascism and built a superpower, while others see him as a criminal whose victims number in the millions. The security services he built evolved, but never disappeared, and the techniques of surveillance, infiltration, and preemptive elimination he perfected have been adapted by authoritarian regimes worldwide. The assassination attempts against him, both real and fabricated, served his purposes by justifying the very paranoia and violence that defined his rule. They remind us that in totalitarian systems, the line between genuine threats and manufactured crises becomes deliberately blurred, with each feeding the other in an endless cycle of fear and control. Understanding these attempts to kill Stalin requires understanding the system he created, a system where assassination became both unthinkable and constantly imagined, where security measures reached absurd extremes yet never quite eliminated the possibility of violence, where the dictator's survival depended on making everyone else less secure. The four documented attempts represent only the visible surface of a deeper reality, a society where countless others must have imagined Stalin's death, wished for it, perhaps even planned it in ways that left no historical trace. That so few attempts actually materialized speaks to the success of totalitarian terror in suppressing not just action, but the very possibility of action, in making resistance seem futile before it could begin. The men and women who tried anyway, who risked everything for a chance to change history, deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to Stalin's survival, but as evidence that even in the darkest systems, human courage and the desire for freedom never entirely disappear.